Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining this webinar. Very warm welcome. My name is Erica Hope. I'm the Director for Climate Planning and Laws at the European Climate Foundation, which is a philanthropically funded foundation with the mission to try and help drive the transition to net zero economies through strategic grant making, thought leadership, convening, and a variety of other activities. And yes, this was supposed to be a physical meeting. It was going to be a workshop or a mini conference in the Scotland House on the Schumann roundabout. But we decided a week or so ago to move it to webinar format, and obviously it seems that was a good decision. I think probably many of us have been spending the last couple of days trying to get to grips with new technology and rearranging our working spaces and so on. But it's actually really nice, I must say, to be connecting with you all through this format for what may be one of the first public discussions on the EU climate law. We think, and hopefully getting to grips with this way of working is going to be a good investment for the future, very compatible with moving to a net zero economy. And I must say, actually, normally we are quite a lot of people. About 120 people have registered. I think we're not quite at that many having joined, but certainly well over, more than 70 by now. And we're coming from, there's some people from the Commission, from the European Parliament, from different think tanks and NGOs. We have also people from a wide variety of industry organizations, including energy companies and energy efficiency bodies and so on. So I think this is a good set of people to be having this conversation with. And I think it's really inspiring, actually, that so many people are still joining this discussion despite all the disruptions and the shocks of the past few days. And I think and expect, actually, that it probably is a sign that the proposal that we are here to discuss is really designed to protect Europe and the world from the major threat of climate change. And of course, this is a threat that perhaps more than the virus, we can see it coming. And the consequences, if we don't get on top of it, will be extremely dramatic and not reversible. So I think we can see that in proposing a climate law for the EU, the European Commission is really seeking to take the responsibility that we need to see from governments and politicians and those we entrust to take charge to protect their citizens from risk. So I think it's a very important proposal and a very important discussion. And we wanted to, now that we've had the Commission proposal a couple of weeks ago, to try and first take a look at some of the innovations that have been happening in climate governance at national level over recent years. So this is something that the European Climate Foundation has been looking into for a number of years to help us get off on an informed footing before we move to a more detailed discussion of what is happening with or what is not included in the European Commission's proposal. And just a word on climate laws before we move a bit more into the practicalities and then the substance. Climate laws do not replace all of the sectoral policies and the other pieces of the climate architecture that the EU has already adopted and that member states have already adopted. A climate law, whether it's at EU level or at national level, is basically a sort of legal umbrella that sits over all the rest, or the roof of a house or the roof of a Greek temple, which serves the purpose of helping to make sure that those underlying measures, the pillars that sit underneath it and drive more specific action in the financial sector, in the building sector, in the transport sector and others, to make sure that that is really well designed and really steering towards the end goal that the climate law is enshrining. So the climate law needs to be really focusing on making that framework and being as well designed with the right processes and institutions to ensure that those other policies function properly. So just before we start, a couple of practicalities. I think yes, this is, as I say, the first time I've moderated a webinar, so hoping it will go all right. We have the real technological part in the safe hands of Ecologic, who are our partners in organising this. For those taking part, you are, or those sort of not presenting and so on, you are not having the right to verbally speak according to the way the technology is set up, but you are encouraged to write in the questions section of the that you can see on your control panel. And my colleague, David Lopez, also from the European Climate Foundation, will be keeping a close eye on the questions that are coming in there. And there will be a couple of clear moments in the running of this afternoon where I will ask him to report on what questions are being asked. And I think I don't need to ask you to stay on mute because you are on mute. I would just ask the other presenters and so on to make sure you're on mute when you're not talking. I think you have the capacity to control that yourselves. Yes, so just very quickly, we will have a framing presentation from Sharon Turner, who I will introduce in a moment. Then we will have a presentation from Matthias Duwe of Ecologic of what has been happening at national level. And then we will move to a more discussion of the EU proposal with an initial presentation from Nils Meyer-Ohlendorf of Ecologic Institute about an ideal climate law and how the EU proposal matches up. And then we will have what will sort of loosely be a panel discussion as best we can in webinar format with some responses and reactions to what's been said by Stefanie Hiesinger from Frans Timmermans' cabinet in the European Commission. Very pleased also to have with us as a late addition Bloss, who is the rapporteur from the shadow rapporteur for the Greens EFA group in the European Parliament, giving us another institutional perspective and the Greens perspective. And then we will have also Elisa Gianelli, a researcher from E3G, Alex Mason from WWF European Policy Office, and then some more comments from Sharon Turner. And then we will have some, hopefully, a bit of time for some questions or comments from the floor. And then hopefully we will all wrap up nicely by 5:30. So that's the best laid plan. And I will now give the floor to Sharon Turner, who is a visiting professor at the University College London and Sussex University in the UK. She's actually the former director of the governance programme at the European Climate Foundation. And so she actually initiated a lot of the work that we've been doing looking at climate governance arrangements. And she's going to give us just a sort of framing, contextualizing presentation on why would we need an EU climate law. Thanks, Sharon.
Thanks, Eric. Lovely to join the meeting and have the opportunity to address the webinar. This is my first webinar also, so I hope that the technology at this end bears up, but we'll see how we go. I think the first thing for me to say is that in understanding why the EU needs a climate law, we must first start by facing the scale of the task involved in implementing the Paris Agreement in Europe. Creating a carbon neutral Europe by 2050 at the latest, and having even a remote chance of aiming for the 1.5 temperature goal, will require the EU to deliver a process of change on a literally unprecedented scale, and will significantly affect economies and societies across Europe. How well the EU institutions manage this change process will almost certainly make or break the Union's reputation as a global force for peace and sustainable prosperity in the world, and it will certainly have a critical impact on global momentum towards implementing the Paris objective. Although the EU is to be congratulated for years of climate leadership, its current climate policy framework and governance framework are not designed to implement they're not designed to enable the EU to drive the rapid and radical changes needed across the entire economy between now and 2050 in order to deliver Paris in Europe. The constraints of time prevent a detailed presentation of those problems, but I think the present audience will acknowledge many of the core problems in that comment. In brief, the European Climate Acquis and climate governance regime reflects some of the following problems. A very strong emphasis on short-termism, in that the 2030 timeframe is largely positioned as an end in itself, rather than simply as an interim milestone in a longer term and highly ambitious change process. Secondly, it also reflects a commitment to incremental change rather than change on a scale demanded by IPCC science and the Paris Agreement. It also reflects substantial inconsistencies between near-term EU policies and the Paris objective, some of which represent significant barriers to implementing the agreement in Europe. The regime also reflects a reliance on decision-making processes that empower or that tend to empower the lowest and slowest common denominator. The regime significantly lacks transparency. There's a significant lack of transparency surrounding EU policy development processes and a significant accountability gap in that enormous trust and powers are invested in the European institutions, but all are virtually immune from legal accountability before the European Court of Justice by the very citizens who will have to live with the consequences of any failure by those institutions. As Matthias will shortly explain, climate laws can be designed in numerous different ways. However, the most effective models have tended to embed certain core features which work together to create the enabling conditions necessary to deliver a sustained focus on implementing Paris-compatible policies. And it's important to emphasize that none of these features or enabling conditions are currently or reliably delivered by the Europeans' existing acquis and frameworks. I think chief amongst those are, first of all, that the most effective climate laws embed a clear and binding duty to deliver the Paris objective. By doing so, these sorts of climate laws harness the symbolic and real power of law to clarify in the strongest possible terms the long-term direction of policy travel for policymakers, for citizens, for business, for investors, and for global partners. By clearly committing to the Paris objective in law, the climate law functions in effect to end distracting debates about whether to act and refocuses the entire policy and political effort onto how to achieve the Paris objective, and thereby unlocks far greater investor confidence. And achieving that shift will be pivotal to Europe's capacity to implement Paris. I think a second major feature of climate laws that are really successful also embed a robust long-term process for ensuring that near-term policy making remains consistent with achieving the longer-term Paris objective. By doing so, climate laws ensure a stable, long-term policy focus on delivering the Paris objective. They also ensure those processes also ensure that more ambitious policy action is taken earlier, and also those processes build capacity within the policy and stakeholder communities to engage in holistic discussions about the various scenarios for delivering the 2050 objective, and also capacity to make choices about how to manage their economic and social justice implications. The third major feature of effective climate laws is also to embed the legal and institutional arrangements for ensuring that the process of policy making is both stable, but also is highly transparent, strongly rooted in science, and ensures that policymakers are subject to meaningful democratic and judicial oversight, and are therefore genuinely accountable for their actions and inactions. And these arrangements have contributed significantly to building public confidence in the policy's objective, in the policies adopted, and to protecting political leaders from the backlash to often controversial but necessary choices. In conclusion, the experiences of early climate law adopters strongly suggests that a well-designed climate law for Europe will reflect the important weaknesses inherent in the EU's climate acquis and will play a decisive role in delivering 4 outcomes that will be crucial to Europe's ability to implement Paris in an orderly and timely manner. First, it would unlock, and I'll just say these briefly, it would unlock a least cost transition that will enable Europe to support its people and businesses through a process of profound change. It will enable Europe to also protect those people and businesses from the serious shocks and disruptions that will otherwise be experienced if Europe delays meaningful action. A well-designed climate law will also protect the European institutions themselves from the political backlash to climate action taken in good faith but behind closed doors, and will guarantee long-term political trust in the Union's mandate to lead the journey to carbon neutrality. And lastly, a well-designed European climate law will send a powerful message to global partners that Europe is serious about Paris, which will help to build global momentum towards implementation and create positive feedback loops to political leaders across the world and within Europe. And for me, in conclusion, the question for the European institutions should not be whether to support the Commission's proposal to adopt a European climate law, but really to ask, is the proposal sufficiently well designed to ensure that the EU institutions can actually make the Paris objective a reality in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sharon. I think some very powerful thoughts there. And I think what we see is that in principle, the climate law, the EU climate law, has the potential to have enormous symbolic power, but also real power as well, if it's well designed to really actually drive actions. And I'd like to pass now to Matthias Duwe from the Ecologic Institute. He's the head of the climate programme there. He's going to present to us some of the key findings of a report that was published a month or so ago called Climate Laws in Europe, Good Practices in Net Zero Management. And this report, which I'll let Matthias describe, has been published in a series of reports that you just saw on the screen there, the Net Zero 2050 series of reports, there you go, that we have been publishing over the past couple of years from ECF in collaboration with various different partners. We began with an economy-wide assessment of how you might reach net zero by 2050. That was back in September 2018, when net zero was not yet such an accepted concept as what it is now. So that's one very positive change that's happened recently. We then did some deeper dives into certain other sectors. And more recently, we've published a couple of reports looking at the actual governance arrangements, the institutional and policy arrangements for delivering these things, including an assessment of the draft national energy and climate plans, and now this look at national climate laws. And actually the thumbnail that you can see there is the Spanish translation of the summary, because we are hoping that this report will be of great value both for the EU debate, but also for the debate on national climate laws that's taking place in many countries around Europe at the moment. So Matthias, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Erica. I hope you can hear me well. Just give me the nod. Yeah, I hope that works. So hello, everybody. I'm great that the otherwise not very comfortable situation is helping us create some innovations. And so I'm glad that the presentation itself was not canceled, and I get to tell you now a little bit about the report that I was able to write with support from the European Climate Foundation and input from a lot of expert colleagues, to all of whom we owe that gratitude. And the largest of those from my side goes to my colleague Nick Evans, whom I've had the pleasure of writing this report with. I should say the full version, you know, is like a good 60 pages, I think, but there is a summary, not just in this presentation, but a summary, an 8-pager that you can more easily digest maybe. So I invite you obviously to have a look at the full thing. Now, this is building on quite a bit of work that we've been doing over the last couple of years, in particular looking at governance frameworks at different levels, subnational, national, and at the EU. Some of the inputs here from my colleague Nils, whom you will still be hearing from in a second. And but specifically for this report, we were looking at 9 national climate framework laws, 8 of which from EU member states, you know, the Scandinavian trio, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and then France, Netherlands, Germany, Spain, and the former member states, the United Kingdom, which is actually the first of this lot to adopt a climate law. And all of those, what they have in common is they have a long-term perspective. So this was one of our criteria for choosing these. Very briefly, because it's important to be correct, The Danish law, for example, is in the process of being revised, and what we were looking at for the analysis is not the one that's currently in place, adopted in June 2014, but it's the proposed draft law, which represents a strengthening. And also in the case of Spain, it was a draft of a law that we have analyzed. So the final, hopefully a law that will be adopted over the course of the next couple of weeks or months may look slightly different, of course. And then in Ireland, there's also an amendment bill that's on the table. This we did not take into consideration anymore. So this just for background as to what's our source data here. Key insight, and I have 7 of these to present. The first one is, you just saw a list of 9, there are more. There's actually a majority of EU member states that now already has a national climate law or is preparing one. It's just that at the moment, not all of the ones that are currently in place already include a long-term perspective. And I'm very grateful for Sharon outlining, what the challenge is here. We're having to rework our political and systems and other systems to be getting into the drive to start transforming economic sectors towards the long term and also our systems. And that's different from just looking at achieving a 2020 target, for example, which is what the Austrian law, for example, was initially designed to do. So the 9 ones that we were looking at are in the dark green category here, but they are only part of the countries that are already have a law or are developing one. This is now a game of where some of the remaining ones are joining the majority. And then, key insight number 2, you could, in theory, of course, put a lot of the things that are included in climate laws in place through a declaration on this is our governance system for the future for climate policy. But the reality is that especially since and around the adoption of the Paris Agreement, governments that have chosen to put such a system in place, they have gone for national framework laws as an effective management system for their long-term climate policy. And it's really Paris that has brought an emphasis to the long term. And so why is that? These are our assessments. This is not something that's written directly necessarily into the laws, but from our perspective, the reason for this is that with the realization of the long-term challenge here, this is a response that's required from governments that they are not prepared for, neither through their current institutional structures, but this is a long-term response that's required, that needs action now, but actually it has to be geared towards a very specific and desired outcome over the course of 2 to 3 decades. And so part of the realization here is we need to put something in place that connects the now with the future and helps us chart a path towards that specific goal. And why then go for a law in that case? First of all, it's the strongest signal that government can send. We are adopting a law where we are putting obligations for ourselves in place. And so it's a way of saying we really mean business on climate action. And then also putting a law in place means it's slightly harder to go back on than a political declaration, where be that for swings in opinion polls or after an election, you have a law in place, makes it harder to reverse policy. And it also does what Sharon alluded to earlier. It basically helps governments protect themselves and their decisions on short-term policies from a vested interest, but also from potentially political opportunism. In a way, you could say it helps to put it transcends contemporary political debates and helps put a framework in place that, if followed, can help you overcome these to get to your long-term goal. And then it's an opportunity to professionalize also political structures through clarifying responsibilities, for example, putting new institutions in place. Now, number 3, of course, the law is really only as good as the political support it carries, because it does need that. It could easily be changed if there wasn't support for it that also goes beyond just one government that's currently in place. And what we found in the laws that we looked at, there is indeed broad political support in all of the cases. And in fact, that's not something that's come about by chance, but it's actually created in part through the development processes of these laws. Take the example of Sweden, where a cross-party committee was put in place that analyzed the experience in other laws. They actually went to the UK and spoke to members from both Labour and the Conservative Party there as well before they presented a proposal for the Swedish law. And so I think there are several examples here that one can show that buy-in across an existing government can be created. And what you see here in the slide, it doesn't come out quite as well. Go a little bit closer to your screen, zoom in. It's a tweet by the responsible Danish minister Dan Jørgensen, who tweeted in the beginning of December, "We have a deal, climate law, hashtag." And this was after negotiations with parties beyond the current government coalition that came into power in summer. And now, you see from the green framed statement, there are 8 out of 10 parties in the Danish parliament that actually support a revision of the Climate Act, and with very clear specifications on what it would include in the future. So a strong example of how cross-party government support can be created. Now to my fourth point, which is speaking a little bit to Sharon's point about there being core features. Here I'm talking about common elements, and those we can clearly see in the laws, because in the end, even if they differ in the way that they then fill these elements or they exactly design them, they try to answer the same questions that all governments have. The obvious first one, what is it that we're actually wanting to achieve? What are our targets? And putting that in place and enshrining in the law is the way that you express what's our direction of travel. And then the second obvious follow-up question is, so, okay, we know what our target is, but how do we get there? And this is about procedures for strategic planning, and then for formulating policy, concrete actions to be taken in the near and midterm that will get you on the path outlined by your strategic plan. The next obvious step is, so we've got these measures in place. How well are we doing? We need data to help us figure out, if we are actually on track. And then, that information can also help, together with the input from public and scientific advice, to potentially revise the actions that are being taken and the plans and the targets. And crucial point, of course, I mentioned earlier, figuring out how government should organize itself is part of a driving driver behind the adoption of the laws. Who does what is something that can be answered clearly in putting down clear institutional arrangements and setups in the law. And then provisions for inputs by those outside of government is also something that the law can put in place to clarify what the avenues are for taking on board other input. And here we have both scientific advice, and I'll get to that again in a second, and public consultation. So my next point is actually trying to give you a little bit of an assessment. How well are these systems then working? I'm just going to give you some highlights and some not so great points. First, on the highlights. The scientific advisory bodies I just mentioned, all of the 9 laws that we analyzed make use of an independent scientific advisory body. This is not something that's stemming from an obligation from UN or EU laws that member states have to implement, such as a number of other elements that actually prescribe what they're putting in the laws. But this is something that all of them have individually decided is a good idea, to produce some independent, neutral advice in terms of options for action, but also to keep government honest, to serve as an oversight body, to help with the monitoring, to analyze whether the data is accurate that governments are using, etc. And it's only out of the 9, only the Netherlands that have not created a new body for this case. They are using their well or trusted and long established PBL, which is a great scientific and academic record. But all of the other ones have actually put in place new bodies for that purpose, climate councils that are almost all of them made up of scientists. Then, what also all of them have is actually a good level of transparency being created through annual review processes and progress reporting. And now, of course, annual data gathering and reporting on greenhouse gases is a UN and EU obligation. But what is different here is that there needs to be an opportunity for a national debate on how well are we doing. You know, submitting something to the EEA in Copenhagen or to the UNFCCC in Bonn is one thing, but having a national debate because your progress report is sent to Parliament, that's a different thing. And all of the laws have something along those lines. And then what's really important, if you remember earlier my little cycle of the elements, you know, the data should help inform what's being done on policy action, especially if there is a gap towards progress. And the majority of laws have a specific mechanism to trigger additional action if that is the case. I think that's a really crucial function. On the not so great side, we were actually surprised to see that on intergovernmental coordination and which ministries are responsible for what, there's actually a low level of detail in the laws analyzed. Some have a very clear system. Take the Finnish law, which has a separate article, but you know, a number of them don't really specify. There's like government is the body that's often named as the responsible body, which from our perspective creates a little bit of a risk that targets are not met if not all ministries that need to be producing and contributing policies are actually obliged to be involved. And then on the public participation side, actually interesting to see that many laws don't have a lot of specificity on how the public will be involved, despite the fact that a number of these same countries actually have good traditions and actually have stakeholder bodies to organize public input. So, you know, maybe in part this is because this function is already taken up elsewhere. So further analysis will be required to determine that.
Matthias, this is brilliant, but could I just ask you to speed up a little bit? You've got five more insights.
Sure, absolutely. So, no, not 5 more insights. I have 2 more. So I will, hopefully it build a 7. I'll be quick on the last 2. So since we specifically looked at the ones that are long-term, the idea was how do we figure out whether they're really helping to guide policy towards the future? And that's something that can still be enhanced for sure. We looked at 5 points. What about the targets? The majority of these countries now have long-term targets clearly in place. They're actually almost all of them net zero now. The UK and France changed their targets and their laws in that respect just last year. And a number of countries are really in good ways of also setting interim targets as a key stepping stones in between. What's not so great is the way that iterative strategic planning is included in the laws. There's that component to figure out how are we getting to net zero. Some laws have that quite explicitly built in, others do not. And it's a little bit thanks to the EU legislation that we have, the acquis, that all of them are actually obliged to do long-term strategies. To what extent is that long-term actually informing policies? The connections are there, but they could be stronger. There is none of the laws really has a climate neutrality compliance check on their existing policies. Some of them, though, start including mainstreaming provisions to include climate action into other policy areas. For example, a number of the laws make a link between annual budgeting processes and their climate policy processes. So there are some positive examples there. And some of them also include specific signals for the long-term structural change that's required directly in the law, such as proposed ban on combustion vehicles in Spain, to give you just one specific example. Let me close with just the obvious maybe insight that among the laws that we looked at, and everyone you find good practices, there's a lot to learn from for the EU level, but also for other countries that are now considering putting a climate law in place. Very detailed ways to fill in and the various design elements that I showed you. So we hope that, and we can already see countries copying and pasting certain elements, adapting to their context, and hopefully they'll be, using the good practices available to the design their own. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Matthias, and apologies again for for having the wrong number of insights. But no, I think what is really nice about this report is it gives really a very structured basis to look at what are the functions that a climate law can serve, to then consider in each context, be that a country or the EU level, which of those are actually already served by what is in place in the country, and what can be added value at that level. Before we move to the discussion more specifically of the EU law, I just want to take a moment to check whether there are any questions that have come in from those taking part in the webinar. David, do you have anything to check in terms of clarification questions?
Hello, Erica. Hello, everybody participating. So far, I see no questions. If you have any questions, in order to pose it, please do click on the question box. And well, just as I was speaking, I have two questions from our colleague, Delin. So I will read them out loud. The first one is a question on the long planning. The draft EU climate law refers to net zero 2050, but at some point it was mentioning what happens after 2050. Because the question will be for Stefanie from the Commission to mention why that was not included. We also have another question on the same side regarding going negative after 2050 and what happened to that very long-term goal. Is there a way of including it again?
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, those are obviously questions more specifically about the Commission's proposal. So we'll make sure we capture those at a later point. But yeah, so please don't be shy. Do use the question function. It works well, I think. But now, without further ado, I shall pass over to Dr. Nils Meyer-Ohlendorf, who is another of the experts from the Ecologic Institute, and he has actually been thinking for some time, since well before the Commission proposal, about what would make a good EU climate law. So he's going to describe for us, give us an idea of what's in the European proposal in relation to an ideal version. Nils, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Erica. Welcome to everyone. It's indeed a great pleasure to hold this webinar and to present our ideas on the proposal, and following up on Matthias' presentation. I would like to share 6 slides, and I mean just very few key points what we were considering to be particularly important concerning the Commission's proposal. We have been doing this on the basis of 2 papers that were more general, and 1 draft law that we produced in January, where we actually were thinking through specific provisions how the European climate law could look like. And now we have the great pleasure to look at the proposal. Next slide, please. As most of you know, I mean, I think the milestone, and that's why I put this Roman milestone at the lower bottom. The real important element of this law is the 2050 target, and I think it is a milestone in European policy, climate policy making, and I'm sure we will come back to that issue time and again for the years to come. So this is, I think, a huge innovation. I mean, as Erica said, I mean, early on in 2018, we were not really having a broad consensus on this. Now we do, and now we have a proposal to put this objective into law, which is great progress. Important to understand is this is not an individual target for member states, but a collective EU target, which is a bit peculiar. I mean, this is nothing that you find very often in European law. I mean, we have something similar when it comes to renewables, but the collective nature of that target or objective is very specific. It means that the EU and member states collectively have to work towards achieving that target. Two other points, aviation shipping are not included, and there is no quantification, I call it, or you could also say definition or specification of the term climate neutrality. It could mean many different things, as you probably know. It could mean, for example, give you an example, domestic reductions of, let's say, 90% or 95%, and then you have to have another 5 or 10% achieved through removals. So, but that is nothing you will find in the law. It only says climate neutrality, and that means reducing emissions to net zero by 2050. So, but there are many different ways how to design climate neutrality, and that is important to remember. Next slide, please. As you probably know, the interim targets, that's a big issue throughout the debate, 2030. And there's no specific number specific quantified target in the law, neither for 2030, let alone 2040. What we have is a review of the target in light of the 50-55% proposal, and obligation on the Commission to make a proposal by September of this year concerning the target. In addition, and it's important to separate that, there's an additional obligation on the Commission to make an assessment of EU legislation and to propose amendments, if necessary, to achieve 50 or 55 target. And that is supposed to be done in summer next year. And it means, in practical terms, a reform of emission trading, the climate action regulation, LULUCF, performance standards for cars, renewable energy directive, etc. So it's a huge portfolio, and that is what we will see summer next year. So we will have a busy spring and afterwards. The question is it too late? Is it too little? We have been discussing this for quite some time. Too late in sense of having an impact on the EU-China summit, and thus an impact on the Glasgow COP. If things still work according to time plan, not so likely anymore. What is more certain is that the 50 or 55% is not in line what, for example, the UNEP Gap report proposes, where we have seen a suggestion for annual reduction of the range of 7.6%, which would add to more than 60% for the European Union by 2030. Next slide, please. So I'm sure most of you have already looked very closely through the proposal, and I would assume that many of you have been intrigued by the idea of the trajectory through a delegated act. That is indeed a very innovative proposal. It means that there will be a line drawn from 2030 to 2050. The question is to what extent this would replace target setting. In formal terms, if you look at the wording or in formal terms, it is not the same as target setting, but de facto it comes down to something very similar to that, because when you draw that line, you will have either a concave, convex, linear reduction trajectory, and depending what you have, you will have specific points along these lines, along the trajectory, which in fact are very similar to targets. I would be interested throughout the discussion what is actually in real terms the difference between annual interim targets, biannual interim targets, or the trajectory. That is something we have been discussing quite a bit, but at this point I would assume that de facto the difference is not very big. The proposal sets out a number of criteria for setting that trajectory. One is it starts in 2030, and the other one it ends in 2050. So you might think that this is very clear. For the 2030 target, of course, it is not at this point. It will be when we have a new target. But also the 2050 target as such is not clearly defined. As I said at the beginning, climate neutrality is not a clear term. It could mean different things. So it's not so easy to say, well, we have 2030 and 2050 and we draw that line. It is not as clear because at least the endpoint is not as clear as it seems. important element of the proposal is that the European Parliament and Council may object to the decision of the European Commission concerning the trajectory, concerning the delegated act, and that should be done within 2 months. Next slide, please. So I was already saying, I mean, is it really just drawing a line, or is it quite a fundamental change in EU target setting? I think the answer to this is at this point, if we only would have the trajectory after 2030, it would indeed be a fundamental change. But of course, the co-legislators are still free to set interim targets after 2030. So it's nothing that is prevented by this law. But if this is not going to happen, we will have quite a different system if this proposal becomes law at some point. I think a big benefit, and I think of this very innovative idea, and is it's probably faster and more effective, because now you would have you would turn around the situation. You would have now to organize a majority against the trajectory decided by the Commission, which is politically more difficult than having a majority for setting nationally binding targets, for example. The question is that we were asking ourselves, and I think some of you already have had the same question, is it actually in line with the treaty that the Commission can set the trajectory through delegated act? And the question is Article 290. Some of you might know that this provision says, I mean, that delegated act can only be done concerning, and that is a quote from the treaty, non-essential elements. So anything that is considered essential or politically relevant cannot be regulated by a delegated act. That is up to the legislator to do that. And I think that's a fundamental feature of democracy. So the question is that is actually essential, the trajectory, or is it non-essential? And I would argue at this point that there's a very strong reason to believe that it's actually essential, in particular if it's a change in target setting. It would be a fundamental feature of European climate policy making, and it's a bit hard to argue that this is not essential. So, I mean, is there a way how to bring this idea into line with the treaty? And I think one is that this is actually about reducing the Commission's discretion in this respect. And if the Commission doesn't have this very broad discretion it has now, I mean, it has to set the trajectory according to a number of criteria which are rather broad. So to reduce that discretion might be a way to make it more in line with the treaty. And how to do this is, one is, I mean, that we set an overall emission budget for the EU, so that that would already limit the discretion quite a bit, because the trajectory has to be in line with that budget, and the budget would be set by the legislator. And the other way would be that the legislator or the European climate law itself has already more detailed provision on the trajectory. So it could say it's linear, it concave, convex, it could be a stairway, a stair-like trajectory. So there are many ways how to do this, but the important point that this is done by the legislator to make sure that this essential part is actually within the discretion of the legislator. And the other question we are having is, I mean, when we why do we have a trajectory when we continue national targets after 2030? So depending on what kind of targets these are, I think this is a question we should discuss in the weeks to come. Next slide, please. Another big issue is compliance. I mean, how do we ensure that climate neutrality by 2050 is achieved? As you probably know, I mean, there's an assessment of the Commission of progress toward that objective. The assessment is at two levels, at EU level. If we see at EU level that progress is not sufficient, the Commission will propose measures, policies and legislation. That is number one. And number two is at member state level, the Commission will issue recommendations to member states if they think that if the Commission thinks that progress is insufficient in that member state. and member states have to take due account of these recommendations, but as a recommendation, they are not legally obliged to follow that obligation, that recommendation, sorry. So I think alone the system as such, it would be weak, it would be too weak, simply because there's no clear benchmark for individual member state performance, because it's a collective target for the EU as a whole, number one. Number two, the consequences are soft. It's a soft governance system. There's no infringement. And so for that reason, I think it's important to understand that this climate law needs to be complemented by a robust acquis, and that is in practical terms a continuation of the climate action regulation after 2030. I mean, emission trading is continuing, as we all know, but this is important that this is not forgotten. Next slide, please. So a few words on what is missing. I think a fairly big omission is the lack of independent scientific advisory body, as Matthias was presenting early on. This is a core feature of all climate laws. And if I look, for example, at the UK example, I think these bodies have helped to produce fairly ambitious policies, to build trust, to increase transparency. So I think it's worth to replicate that experience at EU level. And we are doing this at EU level in many different policy fields when it comes to food safety, surveillance of financial markets, chemical regulation, etc. So it's nothing unusual. It's simply that we don't have it at EU level, at the climate level. The other big one is, I already mentioned this, is emission budget. As we all know, for the climate, it's important how much we emit over time. That is actually what makes what matters for the climate. So that is addressed through emission budgets. The other one is sinks. I mean, there's only little mentioning of sinks in the proposal, and it's not specified. And for our preference would be a strong focus on restoring degraded ecosystems as a way to help enhancing sinks. Negative emissions, we had already 2 questions on that. Yes, I mean, the leak version of earlier last week, I mean, it feels like ages ago, that leak contained a provision that the EU would go negative after 2050. It has gone. I think this is it was a step backwards, because as we know, there's actually no scenario that helps us to stay well below 2 degrees without going negative. And to put this into law would be a very strong signal that this is something we take very seriously, and it would have been progress. And then the last point that is missing, it's an evergreen, never-ending story, but I mean, the right place for this is ending fossil fuel subsidies. Having a general provision in that would be helpful. Last slide, please. Conclusions. As I said, 2050 targets, I think it's a milestone, a big step forward. The clear link to 2050 is also very positive. We had this discussion described as a Christmas tree. I mean, to what extent do we put things on this climate law proposal, or whatever it takes for Christmas? I think, yes, this is an important question, but I think the Christmas picture is quite strong, and we should be aware that there are some gaps, and we cannot put too much on that tree, on that Christmas tree. And the last point is, I mean, we need to make sure that compliance remains strong, and that collective responsibility is not turned into collective irresponsibility, so that we don't have a situation where everyone, promises to do something, but in the end, it's hard to hold individual member states to account. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Nils. Excellent. And I think what we have there in Nils' presentation is a kind of hybrid, a description of the key elements of the law, but also starting with a critique. And I think we've seen there highlighted some of the issues that are already emerging in the early part of the discussion. So we're now going to move to what was sort of supposed to be a panel. We'll see how panelly it is in the webinar format, but I think certainly we have some really good experts that we should definitely hear from. And then we will take some questions from the floor. So again, don't be shy with the questions box. First of all, we want to hear from Stefanie Hiesinger, who is a member of Cabinet of Vice President Frans Timmermans in the European Commission. And Stefanie, I think, of course, we would very much like to congratulate the Commission for the Green New Deal and for taking this step of proposing an EU climate law. I think we've heard from some of the presentations already that the climate laws have great potential. There are some ideas on what they should achieve and the extent to which the EU proposal does that, and also some ideas on how the member states have designed theirs. So I would like to give the floor to you to respond as you see fit to these points. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica, and good afternoon to everybody. Indeed, I think we have now already entered into quite some detail on what is in the climate law and what is missing from the law. But maybe just to say that obviously I'm delighted to hear that it's also considered a huge progress, because it's indeed a huge progress. It is. So the Commission has delivered on its clear commitment already expressed in the political guidelines of Ursula von der Leyen, presented in summer last year, to come forward with a proposal for a climate law within the first 100 days. This is what we have done. This law, for the first time, it's the first European climate law, enshrines the goal of reaching climate neutrality by 2050 and sets a framework for achieving it. And that is in itself, I think, a good progress. It means that we will reduce emissions as far as possible, and that we will balance out any remaining emissions by sinks and storage. And it is, in our view, really, really important, because we not only continue to lead on our commitment that we have taken under the Paris Agreement, but we also, and I think Matthias said it, it really shows that we mean business. We want to give a clear long-term signal to investors. We know that the Green Deal and climate neutrality by 2050 in particular means a lot of investment in our economy, and we want to give that long-term signal to investors where the journey is actually going. I also just heard in the presentation before, there's nothing specific on the 2030 target. You all know that the Commission has started its work on the 2030 impact assessment to increase the current target to 50 or towards 55% emission reductions by 2030. That work is ongoing currently, but it's not yet finished. So at that moment in time, or by early March, when the 100-day mark was there, we could not put a revised 2030 target into the climate law. And that's why it was also pointed out, there's a clear commitment to come forward to do that analysis first, and then once it's there, to amend the climate law to actually put the 2030 target in there as well. Then afterwards, and that was also already mentioned, there is already in the Green Deal already the clear commitment to come forward with sectoral legislation such as the ETS or the effort sharing by June next year. Maybe also then, because I don't want to take too much of the time to repeat things that have been said, but maybe a word also from my side on the trajectory, because we obviously think that it's not sufficient to revise the 2030 target and then say that by 2050 we want to reach climate neutrality. We also think we need to connect the two dots, and we need to equip ourselves with tools to evaluate and assess whether we are actually on track. And that is the very purpose of this trajectory, to be sure that in terms of general direction and ambition, we are on track. We clearly show with our commitment to put the revised 2030 target into the climate law once we have done the impact assessment, that we don't mean target setting by the trajectory. The purpose is really to, and Matthias also said it, we need to make sure or have measures on whether we are on track. How do we get to the 2050 climate neutrality target? And that is really done through this trajectory, and then also through this setting out the assessment of the progress that we will do with regard to the member states, which has been aligned in the climate law proposal very closely to the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement and the assessment under the Energy Union Governance Regulation. So every 5 years, starting in 2023, we will look at whether the measures, and be it at union level or at member states level, are still appropriate. And we will also look at the adequacy of the trajectory, because it may well be that we are actually lagging behind, and then we would need to adjust it. But it could also be that we make huge progress, and then the trajectory should also be adapted. So there are all kinds of scenarios covered there. Yeah, I think, well, to the outcome, I already said something, and I think I would leave it then for the rest to the discussions. Well, I hear obviously the concern on negative emissions after 2050. You will understand that I cannot comment on any documents that are not official documents from the Commission. The proposal itself had the objective to enshrine the 2050 climate neutrality target, and that is what it does. But also to say that there's, and you may have seen that in the circular economy action plan that was also already adopted, there's a clear commitment to also incentivize carbon removals and to explore the possibilities for some kind of certification scheme for carbon removal. So it's not that because the climate law now covers the 2050 climate neutrality objective, that the Commission is not doing further work on these aspects either.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Stefanie. I think that's a very good compliment to what we've heard already. And I think it's an important point that just I'm going to pick up, because I know it's been a point of some misunderstanding or misinterpretation on the part of some of us looking at the draft. The fact that the delegated acts process does not actually replace the possible setting of targets by co-decision. It's rather setting a tool, as you say, for assessing progress and consistency checks, which I guess might or might not inform the discussions about targets to be set by co-decision, but it's not actually a direct replacement. Thanks a lot. Now I would like to turn to Michael Bloss, who is a member of the European Parliament from Germany. He has been in position since 2019, and he's the shadow rapporteur for the Greens EFA group on the climate law file. He's been very proactive, I think, on the file, thinking through what could be some elements to include since some months. Michael, I would like to give the floor to you to share some of your early reactions. Perhaps you might also be able to say just a word about, if it's known yet, about the parliamentary timetable, which I'm sure people are curious about on the call as well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this debate. It's very timely and important that we start this debate now. Now we in the Parliament are going to discuss it, and together with the Council see what we will do out of this proposal. I will share with you also the timetable that we have right now, but at the end of my presentation, so you all stay focused. I think with the climate law, there were basically two bigger priorities that could have been tackled. One is the timely publication of the 2030 targets. And since we're talking about the question, how does it actually relate to Paris? They should be, of course, in line with the Paris goals. And it was already mentioned, the 1.5 degree goal would mean at least is minus 65%, but the 55% is a given, and that's there is still the debate whether kind of we should be on the trajectory of Paris if 50% would be the outcome. A second priority with the climate law would be to address the missing or complement the existing EU legislation, as it also has been pointed out by Nils, which would mean an independent scientific body that would be in there, a carbon budget that we would base our climate policy on, what's other things, EU subsidy for fossil fuels, phase out, and this kind of things. So now with the law, we kind of have not really achieved both. So the Commission went for the slim version, but instead of then really concentrating on the 2030 target, it says it wants to base this on an impact assessment. Then I always wonder that from the climate side, we already know what is needed. So we wonder why this impact assessment is needed. Frans Timmermans always says that the climate crisis is like a comet that is hitting the Earth in 30 years' time, and we should do everything to prevent this impact. And I don't think if there would be a comet that would hit the Earth, we would need an impact assessment before we start acting. So we really have to question, and as also many member states ask for an earlier publication of the impact assessment, so we can start the work. And I think this is also needed because, I mean, at least in the current time frame, and linking it back again to the Paris Agreement and to the agenda in Glasgow, the NDC updates should be done. And the NDC update is important because this will be the ones that are locked in for the first review period of the Paris Agreement till 2025. And in order to get globally to NDC updates that would bring us like somewhere close to the 2 degree, we would have to have this early European movement so that also other countries like China will move, and with delaying an NDC update until possibly even like later than Glasgow, is then really risking this very crucial moment, and it risks that we continue for another 5 years for the next NDC update to debate, and then we're really far away from the 2 degree goal. So we would really need to see this 2030 target, and we would need to see it early. Also in the parliament, we have already had several votes where the parliament voted to have the 2030 target set by -55%. Then there is another some questions which we have towards the proposal. The one is the question on the trajectory and on the delegated acts. If we understand it correct, in the way it is currently framed, the 2030 target would be set, and that would basically take the Europe out of the global stocktake process that would lead to an NDC update for 2025. And then the trajectory for the new trajectory would only start from 2030 onwards, so we would be out of the Paris process. Another question is the question of how does it actually refer to, like the question of the definition of climate neutrality, with regard to that we are debating Article 6 also in Glasgow, global carbon markets. We believe that climate neutrality should be kind of an EU internal climate neutrality, and not with taking global offsetting into consideration, but that's also that I think needs to be clarified. And then other things have been mentioned before, that it's a union-wide target. There is a question of the negative emissions, etc. For us, like really important is, again, as said also, it has been also nicely put, the question of an independent scientific body that gives annual reports and reviews and checks how much was already emitted, and that reports to the parliament, so that there is a debate yearly and annually what needs to be done, similar to the UK Climate Change Commission. Then the carbon budget. And also one question we have is that we always now refer to climate neutrality, but what we really should refer to is to the Paris goals, which is staying below 2 degrees and aiming at 1.5 degree. And all the references in the law, they are only referring to climate neutrality, but that is then possibly not in line with Paris. So that should be something which we need to address. Yeah, and then it was quite funny to see that September 2020 is inside the law, even though possibly the law will be only accomplished after September 2020. And with regards to the timetable in the parliament, we will really try to push it through quite fast. So the vote in committee in Envy is currently scheduled for the 6th of July in Strasbourg, and then the plenary vote would be in early September. However, of course, with regard to the current corona crisis, this is all currently not fixed, and then there will be, I guess, postponements happening, but this is how it currently stands. So that's kind of our first assessment from the Green side, but we will now start the work in Parliament and together with the Council to see also what can be done with the law. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. Sorry, just trying to unmute myself there with not much success. That's great. Really useful to get a first sense from your side. Several points there that I imagine Stefanie might want to respond to, but just in the interest of time, I think it's probably best if I pass immediately to Elisa, Alex, and Sharon for their quick comments, and then maybe we take some from the floor, and then Stefanie, I give you the floor at the end to respond together to the points that you can, if that's all right. Thanks. So passing now to Elisa Gianelli, who is a researcher at E3G, one of the leading think tanks, and she is an expert, well, she's on the climate governance, also working on gas and other topics which are relevant as topics which the climate law should hopefully have some influence on. So Elisa, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Erika, and thanks everyone for joining this interesting debate despite the particular circumstances. I will try to keep it short and focus my intervention on what I think it's one of the core functions of the climate law and why I think we should really get it right. And as you, Erika, said at the beginning of the webinar, and I agree with you, the climate law is really the roof of the house, and I see it very instrumental to somehow bring the pieces together and make sure that everything will contribute to the run to 2050 and also beyond. And we know that in the climate law proposals, we have some provisions in Article 2 and Article 5 regarding the alignment of sectoral contribution. We have also some deadlines. We know that for the sectoral contribution, it's 2021, and then for the overall EU legislation, it will be 2023. And what I would like to highlight here is that we are currently in a moment of extraordinary public and internal pressure to take climate action. And I think that the real significance of setting a long-term target is this ripple effect on the broader EU legislation, and really make sure that every piece of legislation will contribute to the achievement of this target. And I feel like we are already somehow experiencing the urgency to avoid inconsistency across policy measures. I will give you a very concrete example for those of you who are based in Brussels or who are following the European debates. Exactly 1 month ago, we were all very busy discussing the Parliament vote on the 4th PCI list, which very concretely is a list of cross-border infrastructure projects that are eligible to get financial support from European and taxpayers' resources. And the main point of the controversy was exactly, let's say, the questionable contribution of some of these projects to the European Green Deal objective. Now, what concretely means is that there was a concrete risk of directing European resources in projects that are unnecessary, while taking away resources from projects that mostly need support in the way towards climate neutrality. And I think that with the climate law, we really have the opportunity to avoid falling into these type of debates all over again. We are likely to have controversial debate on the PCIs every time we will have a new list until the Commission will revise the policy framework behind it. Now we know that some steps will be taken by the end of the year with revised proposals of the TENI regulation. But without going into the geeky details there, I think the overall message and the main takeaway is really to go directly into this consistency framework. Do not wait for a two-step approach, but start from today ensuring that every piece of legislation will concretely contribute to the achievement of the target and do not harm the progress of the EU progress. I think I can stop here for the sake of time for everyone.
Great, thanks very much, Elisa. Really crisp but crucial point there. I think that in the end, that's what the climate law needs to achieve, is this overarching consistency. Okay, I would like now to move to Alex Mason, who is Senior Policy Officer at the WWF European Policy Office. Alex, over to you. Alex, we can't hear you. Perhaps I can unmute you.
Sorry.
Good.
Sorry, can you hear me? I forgot to unmute myself. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Erica and Matthias at Ecologic for inviting us to comment. I mean, pretty much everything has been said already. Obviously, we strongly support the initiative of having an EU climate law. There's a lot in it, as others have said, which is to be welcomed, and it is a step forward in that respect. I suppose it does fall to us as NGOs to point out the gaps. Many have already been mentioned. I would just add a few thoughts on what others have said. So firstly, this point about an independent scientific body, which is pretty much ubiquitous in other national climate laws. I mean, the reason we think it's so important is not that, you know, we think the Commission is evil and not to be trusted, and it's simply that the Commission is obviously a politically led organisation, operates in a political context, and so, you know, we need the Commission to be complemented by an independent, apolitical expert body that can provide sort of analysis and scrutiny of the EU's plans, but also the consistency assessments. So, you know, for example, if you look at the sort of recent past, when the European Commission published its long-term strategy, the Clean Planet for All vision, you know, it published a very, very detailed analysis, technical analysis, in about 400 pages, and analysed a number of different scenarios, but they all started from an assumption that no change would be made to the EU's 2030 target, which of course is an entirely political decision. It's not based on a rational or scientific analysis of the evidence. I mean, as others have said, if you look at the UN Environment Programme emissions gap report, even with no account being taken of consistency, of equity, you know, to stay below 1.5, the EU should be reaching emissions reductions of 68% by 2030, and that's, you know, that's with no per capita or historical emissions or other equity issues being taken into account. I mean, more recently, the climate law proposes a 2030 increase of 50 to 55%. I mean, again, this is not an evidence-based decision. This is a political decision, which is now going to be analysed through the Commission's impact assessment. What we would have liked to have seen in the climate law is not a sort of science-based trajectory after 2030, but a political governance system beforehand. What we would have liked to see is the two connected together, so that the 2030 target was derived from the science rather than being, as I say, a separate political decision. So I think in these sort of issues, you do need an expert scientific body that can point to inconsistencies. And this will also give cover for the European Commission. If you have independent scientists telling you that your common agricultural policies and your subsidies for high levels of livestock production or your bioenergy policies are in actual fact completely inconsistent with your climate targets, that provides cover for the politicians to actually propose changes in the same way that politicians now are relying on expert scientists and medical advisors to explain why we need very strict quarantine conditions for coronavirus. So two other quick things. One is the EU long-term strategy. The vision that the Commission published in 2018 has 8 different scenarios, none of which are consistent with the proposed higher 2030 target. So we think we do need the Commission to publish, to be required to publish a real EU long-term strategy, and then to revise that every 5 years. We don't think it should be a one-off thing. And that would greatly help with assessing the consistency of policies, whether at EU or national level, with the long-term target. And finally, negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal has been mentioned by several people. We think it's curious that you have in the climate law a proposal to increase the emissions reduction target for 2030, but nothing at all on the 2030 carbon dioxide removal side, which is the other side of the equation. If we're going to stay below 1.5 or below, well below 2 degrees, we need to cut emissions very fast in the next 10 years, but also massively increase carbon dioxide removal through restoring ecosystems. We need to do both. And the fact that removals is not mentioned might lead you to fear that the Commission will plan to sort of use carbon dioxide removals to offset the need for fast emissions reductions when it presents its impact assessment later in the year. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. A number of important points there, somewhat reinforcing things we've heard before. Just as the last expert commentary, I will pass quickly to Sharon. Please, Sharon, go ahead.
Thanks, Erica. I'll be really quick as well. My comments, I mean, I certainly welcome the climate law. I think it's a very, very important step forward by the European Commission, and I think that it's incredibly timely, and this is a very necessary conversation for the EU to be having. But my specific comments focus on the provisions in the proposal for enabling effective public participation in EU climate policy making towards carbon neutrality and the Paris objective. And I think the proposals, the provisions in the climate law are, I think, very problematic in this context. And I suppose to clarify what I mean by public participation here, we're talking about the rights of the public's right to transparency, to access to information under the climate law, the public's right to participate meaningfully in decision making about the policies towards net zero, and also public access to justice, particularly at European level. And I think although the EU Commission has, and all of the European institutions have long championed and supported effective public participation in environmental governance, they have done so, they have concentrated the EU effort in the member states. European law has always guaranteed those rights at national level. But at the EU level, it's almost quite the opposite. And I think that the problem with the climate law proposal is that it basically continues and even makes worse that particular pattern, which I think is extremely problematic, particularly on such a sensitive and complex and profoundly impactful area of policy making. And I think just to give some examples, even though Article 8 is a recognition that the Commission is proposing that the EU would emphasize the importance of public engagement in climate action, public participation in decision making, the provisions of Article 8 are extremely vague and underdeveloped. And I think really do not define the quality of public engagement that is going to be supported. I think that certainly needs to be thought more carefully about. I think there's also a kind of a consistent theme across the whole proposal of a lack of transparency about public access to very important analyses by the Commission. For example, the consistency analysis, the timing of the publication of the impact analysis, I think are very problematic, and I think almost certainly breach the Aarhus Convention. And I think the fact that there is nothing at all in the climate law about access to European justice, I think at this point in what is widely regarded as a climate emergency, is a major, major weakness. Even though the treaties allow individuals they have the formal power to challenge action by the Commission before the European Court of Justice, the standing rules have been so restrictively interpreted that effectively those rights are negated. And I think that given that modern standards of environmental governance under the Aarhus Convention, and given the enormous trust that is now vested in the European institutions and the profound implications for people if they get this wrong, if the European institutions have this power but don't use it to achieve the required outcome, the individual citizens of Europe will be directly and individually concerned every day of their lives, and not after 2050, but very, very soon. And I think it's necessary for the climate law to contain clarifying provisions, making it clear that the Parliament, Council and Commission accept that the words in the treaty, direct and individual concern, should be applied in this context, that individual citizens should be clearly stated to be directly and individually concerned by the Commission's decisions and the institutional decisions taken under this law, and should have the legal power and to be allowed to use their legal powers under the treaty to challenge the Commission, the Parliament and the Council before the European Court of Justice if there is reasonable grounds for doing so. And certainly, I think the transparency arrangements need to be overhauled and the participation arrangements need to be overhauled. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sharon. Very strident call there. I think for taking the accountability basically to really another level, which might very well be appropriate in the context of the climate emergency. I see we are actually at the time we were supposed to finish. Given that we did want to just give a moment for some of the questions that have come in, and perhaps the right for Stefanie to respond to a lot of these points. If it's okay for everybody, I would extend by 10 minutes. Apparently I'm reliably informed that the webinar won't chop us off, so we can just use those 10 minutes now. I'm going to pass to David, who can just let us know. I see a few questions have been coming in, so if you can just give us a summarized version of what's come in, please, David.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Eric, and thank you. Questions. If it's okay for everybody, I will just pose 3 of the questions and the panelists can answer, and then we can see whether the rest of the questions can come in. The first one regards to the trajectory, and it says as follows: as the trajectory is not a target setting mechanism, how does this comply with the RACET mechanism? And also in this regard, how legally binding is the trajectory set by the delegated act? As if the co-legislators agree to a different trajectory as part of the post-2030 framework, which climate target takes precedence. Also, we have general questions on the EU scientific independent body, which was mentioned several times. The audience would like to know what are the views from the panelists and whether this role could be played by the European Environmental Agency. And finally, in order to close this round, there is also a question on finance. Given that there is nothing on finance in the proposal, how will be able to implement Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement on making all public, but also private finance consistent with climate goals?
Great. Thank you, David. And I think that first question about the ratchet mechanism was basically seeing to what extent does the EU climate law deliver the Paris requirements specifically laid out in the Paris Agreement. Actually, I think I'm just going to add one more because I don't think we'll have time for a second round. There was a question about whether the EU law could incorporate minimum best practice standards for governance that should be applied at national level as well. So, for example, whether it should include provisions for national governments to set up independent advisory bodies or public participation processes or something like that, looking at the best practice we see coming from national level. Okay, so loads and loads of points there. So about the independent advisory body, the tool of the long-term strategy, negative emissions, the definition of the long-term goal in relation to Paris, the timing and level of the 2030 discussion, measures at national level, the mismatch between the trajectory and 2040, how do we deliver on the Paris Agreement and the finance provisions there, and the incorporation of access to justice rights. Stefanie, obviously you're not going to be able to respond to everything. Please just give us what you can, and then if any of the other panelists want to respond on any points, please just kind of raise your hand. Stefanie, thank you. Oh, we need to unmute you.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. I'm happy to hear that you're not expecting me to reply to all of these points, but maybe, and since it keeps on coming back, one word from my side on the scientific body, and that also covers partly the point on public participation, because, well, first of all, maybe to say that all EU climate policy is in principle deeply, deeply rooted in science and the findings of the IPCC. I think there should be no doubt about that. And when we prepared the proposal of the climate law, we have obviously also looked at practices in the member states or other countries around the world to see what it is that they are doing. And obviously we came across many of them having established independent bodies. I think it's nevertheless worthwhile also to first of all point to the fact that the trajectory as part of the criteria that are listed in this article will be based on best available and most recent scientific evidence. So it's not at all about not basing anything in this law on other considerations than scientific evidence. That will always be covered as much as best available technologies. I think I nevertheless would like to stress that the Commission is nevertheless also independent from national governments. So, and that we already, and that is where it joins the point on public participation, we already have a better regulation framework in place. And that should not be forgotten in that debate. I read recently a report on the UK Committee on Climate Change, where it was actually said that the success of that committee is due to a careful combination of rigorous analysis and extensive stakeholder engagement. And that is precisely the objective of our better regulation policy. So I think to a certain extent at the EU level, we are already well equipped to ensure an objective assessment and that scientific evidence is or covers our policy proposals. Then maybe a point also on policy coherence, mentioned also by Elisa in particular. I think there's a clear commitment to ensure under the Green Deal coherence of policies. There's no doubt that all sectors of the economy have to contribute to the Green Deal objectives overall, and that we will ensure coherence in our policies. But there's also in the climate law in Article 5, paragraph 4, if I may point you to that, a clear statement or a clear obligation for the Commission to include consideration of the climate neutrality objective in all impact assessments accompanying new proposals of union legislation. So I think that is, in that sense, a major step forward, and also not only for the union, but there is also reference to member states having to ensure when they take national measures that the climate neutrality objective and the collective achievement of that objective is duly considered, which then also, when we then talk about access to justice, will or may lead to individuals being able to challenge national measures not having respected that. Then maybe there was one point on the Paris goals and the climate neutrality objective not being domestic. I think the climate law clearly says union-wide emissions and removals should be in balance by 2050. That means it's a domestic target. So I think we shouldn't be mistaken. It's union-wide, it's economy-wide, and it's domestic. So that's rather clear. And also the objective of the trajectory is not to take us out of the global stocktake. Quite to the contrary, we are trying to align the global stocktake and the assessments that we are actually doing, so as not to replicate assessments and increase additional burden or the burden on member states and carrying out different assessments at the same time. I think it should all be well aligned. Maybe what else? I think I mentioned quite many. Maybe also on the public participation, I should also mention the Climate Pact that was actually launched on the very same day. So for us, there's a clear commitment as well to include the people. Frans Timmermans keeps on saying that there will be no Green Deal without the public engagement and without the people contributing to it. We have launched, in particular, under the Climate Pact, a public consultation document, which is not yet the launch of the Climate Pact. It's actually the public contributing and telling us how the Climate Pact should look like. So it's the opportunity for the public to actually shape that pact, and that should not be underestimated. It's not closely linked somehow to the climate law, but nevertheless, there's a strong willingness to keep the public included and to listen not only to the young generations, but also to industries and others who will all be deeply impacted by what we are deciding under the climate law. There should be no doubt about it. And that's also because of this huge impact. And I hear the calls on the impact assessment for the 2030 target, but I think also Frans Timmermans left no doubt about it, that we want to do that impact assessment thoroughly and properly because of the impact, and that we need to have it assessed and be sure what the impacts will be before we come forward with the revised 2030 target. I would leave that, and maybe others want to respond to other points.
Great, thank you very much. A very efficient coverage. I have Alex certainly wanted to come back in, and Michael. Okay, Alex, go first, and Sharon. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, just to respond on the question of the European Environment Agency perhaps taking on the role of an independent body. I mean, we did think about this. It's an interesting idea. The two problems that we saw with that, I mean, firstly is that, on the basis of its statutes, it's to provide objective, reliable information and technical support. It's never assessed the appropriateness of EU legislation or policy, so you'd need to change its constituting regulations. Second point is that it's made up of 33 member countries, which take decisions as part of a management board with the Commission and the Parliament being members as well. So on that basis, it's not specific to the EU and wouldn't be independent of the European institutions or member state governments. So we think it doesn't really fit the bill on those grounds. I also just wanted to say on public participation, and maybe this is something that the Climate Pact can do, I feel that the problem we have with EU legislation on as regards public consultation is we tend to put one question to people. We ask them about one regulation, and we never ask them about the big picture. And I think the parallel would be if you ask people who live in a village, do you want a wind farm at the end of your road? They may well say, no, thank you very much. But if you sit them down and say, how would you like to solve the climate change crisis? Here are the options. There's you can stop flying, you can eat less meat, you can insulate your homes, you can have a wind farm at the end of the road. you might then find that people say, well, actually, a wind farm at the end of the road sounds like quite a good idea. So I think, it'd be good if we could use the climate pact to do the sort of deliberative democracy that we've seen, for example, with the abortion referendum in Ireland, rather than it becoming a tool to try and tell people that they need to change their behavior, but instead to involve them in the full panoply of EU climate solutions. Thank you.
Alex, thank you very much. Michael?
Yeah, thank you very much. And also thanks for some of the replies. I guess the debate has to continue. Maybe just two remarks. One is we are now discussing a lot about the trajectories and about this new mechanism of delegated acts. However, I would caution that this in the end will get through council, as Nils has already explained. So maybe this is also that needs to be maybe some rethinking about how this will be developed in the future. And then second, also on the scientific body, which interestingly now came really up in almost everyone's presentation. And I think the Commission says that it wants to be a political commission, of course, independent of the member states, but still a political commission with an own agenda, which is a good thing, and which, we also support, but it's really doesn't go together with being an independent scientific body. So therefore there is this clear need to have such a thing. And I think it was also well shown that this independent scientific body has advantages on the national level, and I don't see any reason why we would not want to implement the same thing on the European level. Also, I don't see that the better regulation is in any way fit for actually serving the purpose that such a body should serve. But as also there was a question on what could it mean for the national level. I think it could also be used maybe for some member states that don't have an own independent scientific body, that could also work and give recommendations and assessments for member states. So it could be useful on many levels.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Sharon, did you want to have a last word as well?
I may, just very quickly. I think it just goes back to Stefanie's reflections from the Commission about her own perception of and her own experiences of how the Commission is behaving and why it responds to the idea of having an independent scientific body in the way that she has captured there, which I think is actually very interesting, because the UK government, I think, was the first government to create one of these bodies. And it's interesting that UK government itself also engages in very extensive stakeholder consultation before it makes decisions under the Climate Act. UK government is also required to root its decisions, is legally required to root its decisions in IPCC science under the climate law in this country. But even despite all of that, the UK government still decided that there was an additional benefit in creating an independent expert committee under the climate law. And it's interesting, in making that decision, the UK government decided specifically not to create a stakeholder body. The UK's committee is purely populated by experts in different sectors relevant to the transition, but all with this kind of a legal mandate to contribute on different issues. And the central reason why the UK committee was set up was that it would categorically ensure a manifestly open and transparent dialogue about what IPCC science meant for the UK. And I think that it has been transformative. The work of the Commission has been transformative in helping the public to understand why the government is making the decisions and choices it's making, and also in building public trust in the government itself. And I think that that is what the Commission will harness, I think, by being willing to consider an equivalent body for the EU. And I think that there have been very clear instances where the Climate Committee in the UK by being an expert independent body, has actually protected different governments and different politicians from the political backlash of angry responses by vested interests or political opportunism. And I think it's definitely fair to say that the Climate Committee in the UK has played a decisive role in keeping the government complying with the UK's climate law in spite of the enormous political and economic shocks that this country has experienced, not least Brexit and the financial crash. Even in the eye of those enormous political storms, the UK government had to keep complying with the processes under the climate law, and that has made all the difference in this country. And I do think that in terms of the question about having national bodies, I think that the climate law could very usefully set out certain minimum criteria about what is independent and what is an independent body. What types of experts should you have on these sorts of commissions if you don't already have one? What sort of mandate could usefully be given to experts at the national level? And I think having those sorts of bodies in all of the different member states will not only help the Commission, because it will enrich the European dialogue about what the science means in terms of getting to carbon neutrality in a timely and stable manner. It will also help individual countries to stay honest in that conversation. So I would certainly commend it to the Commission.
Great. Thank you very much, Sharon. And I think actually that Brexit example is an interesting one. I think Vice President Timmermans has himself made the comparison that actually the coronavirus crisis shows exactly why we need a climate law to keep on track. So thank you so much. I'm really sorry about the time. I guess this is what happens when you try and squeeze what was supposed to be a 3-hour conference into a 1.5-hour webinar. But I thank very much the presenters and panelists for being so concise, and sorry that you didn't have more time to elaborate, but I think you did a really good job. We will share the slides, certainly. I see that question came up as well. So I think it's been a very lively debate. Really, it's just the beginning. And we see lots of I think we have a very good start in the Commission proposal, and certainly a lot of points of possible improvement, drawing perhaps also inspiration from the national cases that we've seen. I think obviously one thing to be done is to try and get the right balance between improving and making the perfect law, in our view, as compared to getting it adopted in a timely fashion. Although the question of what is timely is slightly moving targets, I think, at the moment, to some extent, although not that much, because the climate crisis obviously has its own timetable. But if we do it well, I think we will be better equipped to manage the shocks, the disruption and the crises that may be coming. And I think also if the EU is already leading in many ways, and if it can lead on in terms of a governance framework, that's also a very, very important contribution. So I would just like to thank very much indeed the presenters, the panelists also. I would also like to thank very much my colleagues David Lopez and Niho Spadin, who've helped a lot with the organisation, and also Clara Oldenburg from Ecologic, and Nick Bergmans, who really helped with the research and also the technology. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you who've been online. I see actually we had over 90 participants at some point, and 2/3 of them stayed online almost all the way to the end. So that's always a good sign. And I think, yeah, this was probably the first of many online experiences that many of us will have. I'm sure it will always have a special place in my heart. But actually, it's been really good to focus on something other than the situation we find ourselves outside now for a while. So hope to see you all soon online or in person. Thank you again, and take good care.
Great. Likewise. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.